Game Theory, Episode 1, The Prisoner's Dilemma, and Why Neither Side Will Stop. It's January 2025, and Donald Trump has just taken the oath for the second time. And millions of people like myself, not just his supporters, but foreign policy realists, anti-war commentators, people who spent decades watching America blunder from one disastrous war to another, have felt something they haven't felt in a long time. That's hope. Because here was a president who told us actually what was the quiet part out loud. No more endless wars, no more regime change. He'd gone through his entire first term without starting a single new military conflict, the first president since Jimmy Carter to manage that. And he talked about ending the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. We should have known better. He talked about pulling back from the Middle East. He talked about focusing on the Western Hemisphere and Asia. And it sounded remarkably rational. And then 13 months later, we're here. And on February 28, 2026, the United States launched a full-scale military campaign against Iran. Let's not call it something that it's not. It's a war. It's not an excursion. Let that sit for a few seconds. 13 months. That's all it took to go from no more endless wars to the deepest American military quagmire since Vietnam. A war in which the U.S. military's own simulations say America cannot win. A war that is threatening to crash the global economy. A war that has no exit strategy, no clear objective, and no foreseeable end. And here's what I want you to understand right from the start. This is not a story about one man making a bad decision. This is a story about a trap. A strategic trap so carefully constructed that once you step into it, you cannot step out. And the tools we need to understand that trap, to really see why this war started, why it can't stop, and where it's going, those tools come from a branch of mathematics called game theory. And so this is episode 1 of Game Theory and the US-Iran war, and I'm your host, Dr. Sanjeev Goel, and today we're going to take you on a trip and learn about the game nobody can win. But before we get into the substance, let me tell you what this series is and what it isn't. This is not a series that's going to tell you who launched what missile, on what building, on what day. There are plenty of places where you can get that information, that kind of blow-by-blow coverage. What this series is going to do is provide you something different. It's going to give you a framework, a way of understanding what's happening on the ground, having you a way to look beyond the headlines to understand the strategic implications of what's going on, and actually understand what's happening underneath those headlines. That framework is the game theory. And I know the moment I say game theory, you think about mathematicians and chalkboards and complicated equations. Forget all of that. Game theory is at its core a study of one beautifully simple question. What is the outcome of your decision? When the outcome of your decision depends on what someone else decides, how should you choose? That's as simple as it is. That's it. That's the whole foundation. And it turns out that this one question, applied rigorously, explains an enormous amount about why wars start, why they escalate, why they drag on for years, even when both sides would clearly be better stopping, and why the smartest people in the world can still walk straight into a catastrophe with their eyes wide open. So over 10 episodes, we're going to apply game theory to every dimension of this conflict, of this war, and understand the oil choke points, the Red Sea shipping, negotiations, the escalation trap, the dollar, fertilizer supply chains, investment strategy, and by the end, you're going to see how this conflict, and really American foreign policy as a whole, in a really completely new way, you're going to see it through the lens of game theory. One more thing. I come from this from a non-interventionist perspective. I believe that this war is a catastrophic mistake. I believe the United States has no business trying to dominate the Middle East militarily. And I believe that the people paying the biggest price for this war are the ordinary Iranians, Israelis, Americans, ordinary people across the developing world who depend on the supply chains this war is destroying. These people never asked for any of this. So that's where I'm coming from. You don't have to agree with me, but you should know where I stand. All right, let's get into it. Game Theory 101. the prisoner's dilemma. So game theory, let me introduce you to a single most famous problem in all of strategic thinking. It's called the prisoner's dilemma. And once you understand it, you will start to seeing it everywhere in business, in relationships, and especially in war. Here's the setup. Two people are arrested for a crime. Let's call them Alice and Bob. The police separate them into different rooms. They can't communicate, and each one is given the same offer. Betray the other person or stay silent. If both stay silent, if they both cooperate with each other, they each get a light sentence, 1 year. Not great, but manageable. If Alice betrays Rob, while Bob stays silent, Alice walks away free and Bob gets 10 years. And the reverse is also true. If Bob betrays Alice and Alice stays silent, he walks free and she gets 10 years. But here's the kicker. If they both betray each other, they both get 5 years. Hear that again. Just take that in. If they both betray each other, they get 5 years. Now think about this from Alice's perspective. She doesn't know what Bob is going to do. If Bob stays silent, Alice is better off betraying, so she can get scot-free, and he'll get 10 years. If Bob betrays her, Alice is still better off betraying. She gets 5 years instead of 10, so no matter what Bob does, Alice is better off betraying. And Bob, sitting in his own room, is running the exact same calculation and reaching the exact same conclusion. So if they both betray each other, they both get 5 years. But here's the tragedy of it. They would both be better off if they both cooperated and stayed silent. 1 year instead of 5. But the structure of the game, the incentives, the inability to communicate, the uncertainty about what the other person will do, pushes both players towards that cliff, the worst outcome. Rational individual choices producing a collectively irrational result. That is the prisoner's dilemma. And that is the engine that drives most of what we're talking about in this series. So now let me show you why this matters for war. Because war is a prisoner's dilemma on a massive scale. Both sides are in almost any war would be better off negotiating a peace, fewer deaths, less destruction, lower cost. And that's the both cooperate outcome. But each side is terrified that if they extend an olive branch, the other side will betray them and exploit that gesture. If I don't stop fighting and you don't, I lose everything. And so I keep fighting. And you keep fighting. And the war grinds on, both people betraying each other, if you want to call it, grinding up lives and resources even when everyone knows that peace would be better. This is not a failure of intelligence. It's not because leaders are stupid. It's because the structure of the game makes cooperation incredibly difficult, even when cooperation is clearly the rational choice. The incentives are rigged against peace. And that brings us to the specific game being played right now between the United States and Iran. Why wars can't stop themselves. Here's the first big idea I want you to take away from this episode. Once a war like this starts, it develops its own momentum, its own internal logic. It stops being something politicians and generals control, and it starts controlling them. Let me show you what I mean with the case study, and what you already know. Let's look at Ukraine. The Russian invasion of Ukraine began in February 2022, about 4 years ago. And from that very first weeks, first weeks, both sides knew that a negotiated settlement was on the table. There were talks in Belarus. There were talks in Istanbul. The outlines of the deal were visible. Both sides knew that continuing war was going to be very costly and was going to cause enormous damage to both of them. Enormous suffering, enormous economic cost, enormous political risk. But 4 years later, that war is still going on. Still grinding, still destroying lives and people and economies. Why? Why? Because stopping a war requires one side to accept something deeply painful, to accept loss, to accept humiliation, to accept terms that feel unbearable. And that is something that leaders find almost psychologically impossible to do. Think about what it means in practice. If you're a president or a prime minister and you agree to a ceasefire that gives the other side significant concessions, what happens to you? Your domestic opponents call you a coward, an appeaser. The families of the soldiers who died demand to know what their sacrifice was meant for. This media runs headlines about your surrender. Your political career is probably over. And that's before the other side even starts making demands and having their narrative of the story. And so the war continues, not because it's rational, not because either side is winning enough to justify the cost, but because stopping is politically and psychologically and strategically more painful. This is war momentum, and it is one of the most powerful and dangerous forces in all of international politics. Now, the war in Iran is going to follow the exact same pattern. In fact, it already has. Neither side is conceding defeat. We are seeing the escalation trap proceeding, even when it's clearly in the best interest to stop, and this war could drag on for years. That's not a prediction. This is a pattern, a historical pattern that repeats itself over and over and over again. But here's what makes this war even more dangerous than Ukraine. And if America wanted to stop, even the president picked up the phone tomorrow and said, let's negotiate, I'm going to go back home, I'm done, the biggest victory ever. It can't. Not because Iran won't talk, but because the terms Iran would demand would be so devastating that America could never accept them. And that accepting them would be far worse than continuing the war. We're going to break those terms down in episode 5, but here's the headline. Iran is demanding close to $1 trillion in reparations and a permanent American withdrawal from the Middle East. And those aren't just opening positions. Those demands are rooted in strategic logic that, from Iran's perspective, makes complete sense. It's a completely rational. Iran faces what it perceives as existential threat. It has been attacked, sanctioned, bombed, encircled for decades, and it has concluded that the only way to guarantee its long-term survival is to ensure America never do this again. And how are they going to do that? They're going to make it so painful for America that they'll never attempt to do it again. And what means that this isn't a war that's going to end in a handshake and a press conference. This is a war where the gap between what each side needs is so vast that there's no zone of agreement at all. And when there's no zone of agreement, the game theory tells us exactly what happens. The war continues by default, by momentum, by the sheer structural impossibility of it stopping. Segment 3. The shock and awe bet that failed. So how did we end up here? How did a president who promised no new wars find himself trapped in the biggest American blunder, military quagmire in a generation? The answer requires understanding a concept from a game theory called optimism bias. And it's devastatingly simple. You don't start a war if you think you're going to lose. Every nation that has ever started a war has done so because its leaders believe that they're going to win. The Germans in 1914 thought that. The Japanese in 1941 thought that. The Americans in Vietnam, in Iraq, and Afghanistan all thought that. Every single time the leaders who made that decision to fight those wars were optimistic about their chances. That's not stupidity. That's human nature combined with a bias we call optimism bias, combined with the information environment around these powerful people, advisors who are telling them what you want to hear. And in Trump's case, that's exactly what's happening. Intelligence reports that are cherry-picked to support the conclusion you've already reached. Media coverage that reinforces the narrative of national strength and invincibility. And that is exactly what's happened here. The plan, and I want to be clear that I'm drawing an analysis from some of the foremost international relations scholars, people like John Mearsheimer, who's been dissecting this in real time. The plan was built on a strategy of shock and awe combined with decapitation. The idea was this: you hit Iran so hard with overwhelming power, precision strikes, you decapitate the regime, take out their leadership, destroy command and control, and cripple the military. And then the Iranian people wake up, who have been living underneath these sanctions and hardship for decades, see their government has toppled and crumbling, and rise up. That was the plan. They overthrow the regime themselves, and America gets its victory without ever putting boots on the ground. Well, that was the plan. Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, quick, clean, decisive, like Venezuela, where the Trump administration supported a regime change operation that took place in about 24 hours. That looked relatively painless, no one died, no boots on the ground, super easy. But Iran is not Venezuela. Iran is 90 million people. The regime has been in place for over 40 years, and the people making this plan either didn't understand that or didn't want to understand it. Iran has been studying America's military playbook for over 20 years. 20 years. They've watched what's happened in Iraq in 2003, how America achieved air supremacy in days, rolled into Baghdad in weeks, toppled the regime in under a month. And they asked themselves, how are we going to make sure this never happens to us? So they built an entirely different kind of military. They didn't mass their forces in the open for Americans' jets to destroy them. They dispersed them. They hide. They dug underground. They used asymmetric tactics, drones that cost $5,000 to build, sent against interceptor missiles that cost $1 million each. They deployed hypersonic missiles that can threaten aircraft carriers hundreds of miles offshore. They built a network of proxy forces across the region, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Syria, that can open new fronts faster than America can respond to them. And here's the detail that should keep every American strategic planner awake at night. According to multiple analysts and reports, every single time the American military has war-gamed a full-scale conflict with Iran, America has lost. Every single time, not just some of the time, not just in the pessimistic scenarios. Every time the simulation, the result is the same. The American military, the most powerful military in the world, cannot achieve a decisive victory against Iran in a sustained conflict, because Iran has specifically designed its entire defensive strategy to counter everything that America does well. And so the shock and awe didn't produce the quick victory it was supposed to do. The regime didn't collapse. The people didn't rise up. There was no people rising the street, cheering America. America found itself completely unprepared for a long war, a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition against an opponent that spent 2 decades preparing for exactly this moment, an opponent that holds the geographic choke points that the entire global economy depends on, against an opponent that faces what it believes is an existential threat to its own survival. In that war, the game theory makes brutally clear about who holds the advantage. And it isn't us. It isn't America. And it isn't Israel. The pattern: Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Iran. I want to close today's episode by stepping back and showing you the pattern. Because this is not the first time America has walked into this exact trap. And the repetition is what makes this so tragic. 1965. Vietnam. The United States sends 3,000 Marines into Da Nang. A limited mission, defined objective: protect the airbase, that's it. 4 years later, there's 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. 500,000, 500,000. From 3,000 to 500,000. How does that happen? It happens because of something called sunk cost fallacy. Sunk cost fallacy, one of the most powerful and dangerous forces in all of human decision making. It's what makes some of those horrible stock choices you make sometimes. And we're going to dedicate an entire episode to this later in the series, but it's that important. And here's the core of it. Once you've invested enough, once you've lost enough soldiers, spent enough money, staked enough of your credibility, stopping feels like all these losses were for nothing. So you keep going, not because going forward makes strategic sense, but because stopping is psychologically unbearable. You tell yourself, if we just put a little harder, if we could just send a few more troops, if we could just escalate one more step, we could turn all this around and all those sacrifices, and all of this will have been worth it. If we just do that, I don't want to lose everything I put in already. But you can't turn it around because the structure of the game hasn't changed. It's like doing the same thing and expecting the results to be different. The game hasn't changed. The fundamental dynamics that make this war unwinnable on day 30 are still making unwinnable on day 300 and day 3000. We saw in Vietnam, we saw in Iraq, where mission accomplished turned into an 8-year occupation. We saw in Afghanistan where we stayed for 20 years and left with nothing to show for it. And we're watching it again, right now, in Iran. There are already reports of Marines being shipped out to Okinawa, from Okinawa towards the Middle East. There's talk about Karg Island, where 90% of Iran's oil is exported. And on the surface, you know what? It makes sense. Cut off their revenue, bring them to their knees, but Karg Island sits close to the Iranian shore. To hold the island, you need to hold the coast. To hold the coast, you need to hold the mountains behind it. And before you know it, you've taken conducting a limited operation into a full-scale naval operation. And it's not a naval operation anymore. You're in a land war. We're inside one of the most geographically challenging countries on Earth. 3,000 Marines isn't going to do it. 3,000 Marines to 500,000 troops, limited mission to total war, it's the same story. And it's starting to play out again. Bias. So that's where we are. A war driven by the optimism bias, sustained by war momentum, and deepening through the sunk cost fallacy. A game neither player can quit because the structure of incentives is built, making quitting more painful than continuing. But today was the foundation, and here's what's coming. In episode 2, we're going to be talking about the Strait of Hormuz, the most important choke point of the global economy, and how Iran's geographic leverage inverts the entire power dynamic that most Americans assume exists. In episode 3, we'll add the Red Sea and show how compound threats create exponential pressure. Episodes 4 and 5 will dive deep into the sunk cost trap fallacy and the negotiation that mathematically cannot happen. Episode 6 will walk you through the 5 domino chain reaction that explains why America can't just leave. And episode 7 covers the hidden costs that nobody's talking about. Fertilizer, potash, helium supply chains that keep 8 billion people fed. Episode 8 maps the escalation ladder and shows why every rung makes it worse. Episode 9 translates all of this into an investment strategy, and episode 10 asks the hardest question of all. Is there a way out of this that doesn't end in catastrophe? That's the journey. 10 episodes, 1 framework, and in the end, I promise you, you will never look at war the same way again. If you find this kind of analysis valuable to you, subscribe, share this episode with the person you think who needs to hear it, a friend, and leave a comment. Do you think America can find a way out of this trap? Or is it going to drag on for years, just like every war before it?